Hey guys, it's Ashen from Ashen Warrior Props, and today we're going to build the Witch King's Flail. This build today is going out to my buddy Dummy Cosplay on Instagram. He asked me to help him build this, so I figured I'd put together this video. For starters, the base of both ends of the flail are made from an 1.25 inch dowel rod, which you can start by drilling 2 steel eyelets into, and then starting a chain starter, I think is what they're called. I can't remember, I'll have to look at the box. Next, I wanted to start on the handle of the flail, and I wrapped it in some 2mm HD foam just to give it a safe and textured grip for later in the build. Next, there's these 4 spiked ridges that go along the hilt of the flail. I made the base template out of a piece of cardstock just to measure it up and make sure I got everything how I wanted it, then just cut 4 out of 6mm HD foam. Underneath the spikes on the spiked ridges are these little subsequent ridges that are about 1 inch wide that just kind of sit underneath each of the triangle parts. After I cut all of them out, I simply attached them using contact cement. For those of you who don't know Ashen Bug, she's a partner here at Ashen Warrior Props, and she helped me for a big chunk of this build. She handled the head of the flail while I was working on the hilt. There's a pretty big section of this build that involves sanding, so big props to her for helping me build this and sand the entire thing. The head of the flail is extremely tedious. There's 8 blades, and each of those blades has 2 subsequent spikes that have to be added on either side and then sanded. I think in total we spent around 4 hours sanding the entire thing. Back to the hilt, there's these little ridges, or again ridge spikes, whatever, that sit on the top and bottom of the hilt of the flail. You simply cut 8 of those out and start attaching them with contact cement. Once you've got 8 of the spikes cut out, when you attach them, I tried my best to make them evenly spaced, and it does take a lot of adjustment for the top and bottom of the flail. You'll see how even they have to be just to get it to have the proper shape. Even with as awkward as the ridged spikes are, the thing is surprisingly cozy to grip. Next, I simply sanded down each of the ridges to give them more of a bladed effect. Each one looks sharp in the movie. I've spent way too long looking at the one scene in the movie where he has the flail to notice that they are cut like blades, so I simply sanded down the corners to give them more of an edge. Here's more sanding at work. It goes on for a long time. On to my favorite part of the build. The chain has 2 spikes on each end, or on each link of chain. These were made entirely out of HD foam clay, which I simply sculpted into shark tooth shapes. There's several different shapes you can kind of mess around with, but all in all you need to have a spike shape with a curve on the inside that's going to be attached to the link of chain. The chain we're using is plastic, just to be more con-safe, and it holds the foam a little bit better. To get the U-shape in the foam, we simply just kind of pressed it up against each chain link, just to get the shape accurate to each link. After 2 days of drying for the foam clay, it was time to attach each spike. I started by sanding each of the chain links just a little bit, enough for the glue to hold on. Then did the same process over on the spikes, waited for the contact cement to get tacky, and simply attached them. In total there were 32 spikes. After that, I simply went over it with the heat gun just to kind of heat treat it and reinforce it, especially because this part is more fragile because it's going to be flung around. I wanted everything to be just a little bit more sturdy. So for the assembly of the head of the flail, there are 8 blades, and on all of the 8 blades total, there's going to be 32 of these little spikes that she's making here. Each one of the angles on the spikes needs to be cut at a 45-degree angle to just help later when we sand. Once all the spikes are made and cut out, you're going to add them to the edges of the blades like here on both sides. Once all of them are attached, just prepare for an ass load of sanding because your next few hours are going to be consumed by it. They should be sanded down to look something like this when they're done though. After the hilt and chain were completed, it was time to move on to the head of the flail. I started out with the same process with my 1.25" dowel rod. I sanded it just a wee bit with some heavy grit sandpaper just to make the contact cement hold a little bit better with the foam. After that, I attached each of the 8 blades on there, trying to be as evenly spaced as possible with some 10mm HD foam. You'll notice there's these ridges on the bases of the spikes that go towards the base of the blade on the head of the flail. I just completely forgot to take any footage of those, but they're there. They're just some 6mm ridges that you can simply attach using contact cement. After that, we moved over to the tip, which we simply sculpted out of some HD foam clay. Up next, we finally get to test Flex Seal on an actual prop. My last video, I actually compared Flex Seal and Plastidip on props, and we went over that Flex Seal has a really amazing texture for Lord of the Rings style props. So for this, all I did was go over about 3 coats with unheated Flex Seal. I did the same thing for the chain and the flail, making sure to cover everything. If you're new to using Flex Seal with props, it does take just a little bit longer to dry, around an hour and a half to maybe 2 hours before you can actually touch it. But look close as you're spraying it to see the really amazing texture you get from this. Once the Flex Seal was dry, I want to achieve a dull, rusty iron effect with this. So I went over the entire prop with a base coat of graphite powder that I applied with a sponge. You can also use cotton balls as well. Just go over it lightly. This is going to help really bring out that texture that the Flex Seal gave us. Next, I used a basic silver wax paint with some rubber gloves, went over the high points of the prop to make the texture pop even more, and I went over the edges just to make it look like some more of the original metal material was still there. Next, I repeated the same process with the silver wax paint on the chain. In this, you see me just kind of going crazy with it. Again, I'm going for the high points and the edges just to make the wear and tear look more realistic and to show some of the original metal that would still be there. Next, I mixed a lot of browns, oranges, and blacks together to get some of this rust, dirt, and just grimy look that the flail has. I'm using an old brush that's been dried out and worn just to help apply the paint and make it look a little bit more natural wear. For this, I'm dry brushing it on and then wiping a big chunk of it off. After the rust layer dried, I went back with the silver wax paint and highlighted some more of the high points and a little bit of the texture just to give it some more shine after the rust. I repeated the same process with the chain, and when I was done, I went back over with an airbrush with a dark crimson color to go over it to add just a little bit of blood, not a whole lot, but just a little splatters here and there. The head of the flail's paint job is much of the same as with the handle, a lot of highlighting the high points with the silver, going over it with the rust, rinse and repeat. The flail, however, is a little bit more difficult because it has more nooks and crannies that you've got to work into. One thing to remember when doing the flail is to constantly rotate it and make sure you've covered everything. It took me a solid hour and a half in total to actually get the head of the flail painted. I added another blood texture to the head of the flail as well, but this time I used red spray paint on a piece of paper and just dry brushed it back on there again. Really not a whole lot, but just enough to make you understand that some hobbits' heads have been crushed by this thing. Alright, and with that said and done, here we are. It's super fun build, very time consuming. I think it took us about 4 days to finally put together with all the dry time and all that. But if you want to try the build for yourself, head on over to the links in the description. I'm going to have a parts list. Most of what this build consisted of you can get on Blick Arts Materials. So go ahead and check that link out, and then I'll leave links for everything else down there as well. Thank you much.